Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Sierra Lopez, and today we're going to discuss why we should stop calling people from the US Americans.
So as you can see on the screen, I have divided this presentation into 4 parts. We'll start with the historical context to understand where the term American comes from. Then we will discuss the fallacy of equating American with US American. Then the implications of that equation, which are exclusion and US centrism, and then we'll discuss the best alternatives to the use of American and US American interchangeably. Now, first things first, the historical context. We'll go from Amerigo Vespucci to Thomas Jefferson. Now, Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian merchant and navigator who set forth a revolutionary idea for his time, i.e. that the lands that Columbus sailed to in 1492 belonged to a separate continent. So in 1507, Martin Waldseemüller was the first to name this new continent America, which was a Latinized version of Amerigo. Now you can see the map here and America circled in red on top. This map reflected a huge leap forward in knowledge, recognizing the newly found American landmass and forever changing our understanding and perception of the world. Now, before that time, there was no name that collectively identified the Western Hemisphere, because as you might well remember, the earlier Spanish merchants and navigators referred to this area as the Indies, believing, as did Columbus, that it was part of Eastern Asia. So what are the fallacies of equating American to US American? Now, first of all, there is the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is deriving the fact that something ought to be the case from the mere fact that it is the case. So that's the kind of fallacy that is at stake when people say, well, the word American is based on the last word of the country name, America, United States of America. Well, of course. Now, everybody knows that the demonym, meaning the name of a denizen American, is based on the last word of the country name, United States of America. The question we're trying to elucidate, though, is whether that should be the case at all. So it doesn't help to just say that the word American is based on the last word of the country name. We already know that. Now, just because that is the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that it ought to be the case. Hence the naturalistic fallacy at stake. And when we press our interlocutors with this answer, they are likely to resort to the second fallacy, which is the false analogy fallacy. The false analogy fallacy happens when A and B both have the characteristic P, A has the characteristic Q, and then we deduce from that that B also should have that characteristic Q. So this is what happens when people say, well, the full name of Mexico and the United States is the United States of something. From the United States of Mexico, we obtain the term Mexican. Therefore, from the United States of America, we should obtain American. There is nothing wrong with it. It's logical. Right? Wrong. This analogy is false because in the use of Mexican, there is no ambiguity between Mexico as a country, on the one hand, and Mexico as a continent, on the other. Mexican unambiguously refers to somebody from the country of Mexico. By contrast, America refers to both the country United States of America and the continent America. Consequently, the demonym American conflates the country and the continent, and it does so with pernicious implications. Now, what are those? Mostly exclusion and US centrism. How so? Now, first of all, exclusion. Now, we need to remember that being American does not imply being a citizen of the United States, and vice versa. being a citizen of the United States does not imply being American. We'll explain this later. Consequently, this conflation between American and US American leads to a double exclusion. Now, first, America, which is also called the Americas, if one is to distinguish between North and South America, or even between North, Central and South America, comprise 35 countries and several dependent territories. Therefore, conflating American with US American excludes 34 countries and many dependent territories. Now, not all of them, because as we know, for instance, Puerto Rico is a protectorate of the US and is also American, so American and US American, that conflation does not exclude the people from Puerto Rico, but it does so in the case of many other dependent territories. Conversely, and as I said before, not all US citizens are Americans. Flash news. For example, Hawaiians are US Pacific Islanders. They're not in America, but in Polynesia, which is part of Oceania. And then we have US centrism, which is the tendency to assume that the culture of the United States of America is more important than those of other countries, judging the latter, meaning these other countries, based on US cultural standards rather than based on their own. The fact that the United States of America is the most populous country, the biggest by land, and the richest in America, while also featuring the most powerful military in the continent, effectively turns the exclusion that results from ambiguously conflating America and United States of America in an exercise of cultural appropriation that is at once provincial and imperialistic. Hence why the use of American to mean US American has deleterious effects that are best avoided by choosing a more accurate and less US-centric demonym. And now we need some alternatives, because it's not enough to just criticize something, we need to offer something better than that which we're criticizing, i.e. a better, superior alternative. So let us discuss some of them. Now, the idea of coming up with an alternative is not something that occurred to me this morning, but is something that a lot of authors and intellectuals have thought about for quite some time. For instance, William Safire, in his 1984 work, considered a number of alternatives. For instance, Unitian, or United Statistician, or Usian, or Usonian, which had already been used by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1927, quoting yet other authors, and specifically referring to a form of design, Usonian design, meaning the landscape of the country, particularly the planning of the cities and the architecture of buildings. And also, you might not know that Usoniano is the adjective we use in Esperanto to refer to people from the US, and it also derives from Usonian. Now, none of these alternatives are particularly appealing. Most people, when asked why Unitian or United Statistician or Usian or Usonian are not feasible alternatives, will reply that they just don't sound any good and therefore are unlikely to ever catch on. And I think there's a point to this. So why do they sound so odd? Well, Anthony Zarella ventures the following hypothesis. He says, well, first, it sounds like a fictional alien. And I agree with that. Usonian sounds like an alien, plain alien. And then he puts this ironic quote, "Captain, the Usonian vessel is sending out a distress beacon. Should we change course to investigate?" Second, Zarella says, it obeys pretty much none of the unwritten rules of demonic construction in English. I think this is really important. The reason why Usonian and terms that are alike do not sound right in English is because they do not follow the rules that, as a matter of fact, people use when coming up with demonyms. So he says this is largely, though not exclusively, because USA is an initialism, not an acronym. That is, we say the letters USA, like FBI or EPA, rather than pronouncing the string as a word. Use, like SCUVE or laser. So Usonians, as in Usonians, makes about as much sense as calling the Soviets Usrens or calling the North Koreans the pricks. Okay, maybe the last one's not bad. So you get the point. It does really sound odd, and there is a reason behind it. So these Usonian, United Statistician, Unitian are not feasible alternatives. So what is a better alternative? We have the terms Yankee and Gringo, with which perhaps you are already familiar and have been used since the 18th century. Now, the term Yankee was used derogatorily in the South during the Civil War to refer to those loyal to the Union. Then in World War I, it somehow acquired a more neutral tone, and the term was used to refer to anybody from the US. At the same time, and nowadays, it specifically refers to residents of New England, including Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Now, to the extent to which the term contains a history of being derogatory, and at the same time, it is also ambiguous because it might refer to specific residents of New England and at the same time people beyond that, we ought to discard it as a feasible alternative. Now let us consider Gringo. You're probably also familiar with this. It is used pejoratively in Spanish and Portuguese. Folk etymologies suggest that it comes from locals yelling "green, go home," then "green, go," right? And invading American soldiers, but this is probably false. It most likely originated from griego, meaning Greek in Spanish, to refer to something foreign or alien, something we don't understand or we don't recognize as one of us, as in the English expression, "this is Greek to me," or "this is all Greek to me." Again, to the extent to which the term gringo carries many negative connotations, it is not a feasible alternative to American. So what is a superior alternative? Well, in my opinion, we have at least a couple of terms that are better than American when it comes to referring to people from the US. Now, first, estadounidense. It comes from Estados Unidos, meaning United States in both Portuguese and Spanish. It is used neutrally in both languages, and it reflects the name of the country, the United States of America, while also avoiding ambiguity and appropriation. So in other words, it ticks all the boxes. Unfortunately, we don't have an equivalent term in English, but I think the closest to this one would be US American. Now, US American reflects the name of the country, United States of America, and the continent to which it mostly belongs, because as we saw, there are parts of the United States that are not American in the geographical sense of the term, such as Hawaii, which belongs to Polynesia, right? So it does reflect the name of the country and the continent to which it mostly belongs, and it also avoids ambiguity and appropriation. So it ticks almost all the boxes. It is not as good as estadounidense, because estadounidense would include also Hawaiians and US citizens that geographically do not belong to America, but other than that, it is just as good as estadounidense.
So that's all from me. I hope you found this discussion useful. Please let me know what you think about the best alternatives to American in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.